Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the third day of the 2022 annual meeting of the Washington State Society of American Foresters. I'm Elijah Allensworth, chapter chair of the South Puget Sound chapter, and I'm going to be the MC today. I just want to thank everyone for being here. First and foremost, our speakers, really appreciate it. But also everyone tuning in to listen. I want to thank our sponsors and of course the committee and the Northwest office for helping put this on. So our theme for today is inventory and technology, and we've got 4 talks lined up today. First of all, Mark Kimsey from the University of Idaho talking about research his cooperative has been up to. After him, we'll have David Diaz from EcoTrust talking about Land Mapper, an open source tool for forest planning. And then after that, we'll have another 2 talks by Green River students about the effects of beaver dams and dissolved oxygen on benthic macroinvertebrates. Feel by the end of this week, we're all going to be experts in benthic macroinvertebrates. But I think, the one thing I'll touch on is that if you have questions during the talks, please just throw them in the chat, and Andrea will pick those up and ask the speakers at the end of their talks. Otherwise, when they're taking questions, you can also use the little reactions button to raise your hand if you'd like to ask directly. Andrew, anything else you want to add to that?
Nope, I think we're good. So at the very end of the meeting, the password and the survey link for the CFEs will be shared, and that's how then you can fill that out to get CFEs for today.
Okay, cool. Well then, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mark Kimsey. Mark is the director of the Intermountain Forestry Cooperative, the co-director of the National Science Foundation IUCRC Center for Advanced Forestry Systems, and as well as he does some teaching at the University of Idaho. His work mainly focuses on creating practical real-world solutions in forestry. And today he's going to talk to us about some of that work. Mark, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Can you hear me, Elijah? Am I coming through?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you much. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with your SAF group here today. I always enjoy these opportunities to talk about a passion that we all share, and that's forestry and understanding how we can kind of improve and maintain the forest health and productivity of our region. And so for those that may be unfamiliar with our research group, I'm just going to give a little background of who we are and what we do, and then I'll give kind of an overview of the research we do. And so the title of today's talk is Linking Site and Stand Dynamics for the Improvement of, I title it Dry Site Forest Management. Our research cooperative is primarily here on the east side, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And let's just jump right in. So who are we? What do we do? Our research cooperative is based here at the University of Idaho, and it's a member-driven applied forest research program. It's very similar to those that may know a little bit about the Stand Management Co-op at University of Washington with Eric Turnblom. They're a sister research cooperative to what we do. We often collaborate often with them. And as a cooperative, we're essentially the R&D or research and development of applied silvicultural management research objectives and tools for our members, and they span from both industry, from small to large, for instance, Manulife Investment Management, PotlatchDeltic, and Bennett Lumber Products, to our state agencies, Washington Department of Natural Resources, Idaho Department of Lands, and then to our federal partners, Forest Service, Region 6. And through their directives, we implement research across this region to best understand what drives forest growth, what drives the kind of site stand dynamics that we need to understand to ensure that whatever silvicultural prescriptions that we wish to generate is not only going to maintain the forest health and productivity of site, but are there ways that we can improve upon that, particularly given maybe past management practices. And so this kind of footprint, geographical footprint of our operating region just shows the diversity of landscapes and areas that we work in, all the way from the Klamath Mountains and California Cascades, Siskiyous in Northern California, all the way up into the Northern Rockies, bordering up to the Canadian border. And as you could imagine, we have a very wide, diverse range of different site types, not only from a climatic regime, but a soil parent material and topographic positions, all of which impacts our silvicultural management. And to that degree, and to that end, it all began for us in around 1980. And it started with a question, and that question was, what is limiting the regional forest health and productivity? And this coincided with a considerable body of work that had originated back in the 60s and 70s at not only here at the University of Idaho and the Rocky Mountain Research Station, but also there was a considerable body of work being done on the west side, looking at some of the nutrient limitations and how we could ameliorate those to improve our forest productivity. And so in 1980, a group of private, state, and federal partners joined together to form this research co-op to start to understand what is limiting our regional forest growth. And that was the start of what we were termed back then, the Intermountain Forest Tree Nutrition Cooperative. And it was called Tree Nutrition Cooperative at that time because it was recognized that we had some limitations in, say, nitrogen in our forests. And we all know that nitrogen is one of the critical elements for photosynthetic activity, which builds your photosynthetic factories and is responsible for tree growth. And so we started working and collaborating not only with our colleagues on the west side, but also looking at how could we start to understand those relationships over here where we're often presented with challenges that is unique to the dry side. So it was originally founded in 1980 by Dr. James Moore. And there was a series of what we call site type nutrition initiatives that span the 80s and 90s. And essentially we were looking at the early stages at our primary commercial species in this region, Douglas fir and ponderosa pine. And then we became a little bit more complex and moved into mixed conifer to try to understand once you start to get species mixing, how do those dynamics change, which ultimately led up to our kind of a long-term, broad-scale forest health and productivity study that spanned this entire inland Northwest region, and it built on those early nutrition trials. So what follows is a summary of these early research projects and their significance to not only forest management, but what our current ongoing IFC initiatives are all about. But before we go there, this is going back to some of your maybe prior educational experiences of understanding plant essential nutrients and their function, because we need to understand what we are dealing with and what it affects within a tree to better understand then how we can manage or mitigate the consequences of poor nutrition, let's say, on forest health and productivity. And for us in this region, we have three elements that are critical for our forest health and productivity. There's more, but these are our top three, and that's nitrogen, potassium, and sulfur. And as you can see in their function, they range from your cell productions, photosynthetic activity, disease resistance, water regulation. And as you can well imagine, all of those are quite important when you're dealing with more droughty conditions that we have on this side. And what you also notice is where the source of that comes from. Most of, particularly our potassium, comes from our soil parent material. So that's going to drive how our species can handle water regulation and disease resistance, depending on the potassium availability in those soils. Nitrogen and sulfur is primarily either through just recycling of organic matter or atmospheric inputs. And we all know with atmospheric inputs that in this particular region, nitrogen and sulfur is fairly low, which is also why we have such deficiencies in those particular elements. But understanding what those limitations are important. At the time that we started this study, we were focusing primarily on nitrogen. We did not know these other interactions of potassium and sulfur at that time. At that time, we were focused primarily on nitrogen. And this is when we put in our original study trials. We wanted to understand what are the nitrogen limitations we're seeing and how is it affecting not only growth, but mortality across our region. And so we put in these Douglas fir and ponderosa pine nutrition studies. And we quickly realized that this was considerably more complex than just saying, oh, our species are nitrogen deficient. Our original study design looked at it just by region. So this one graphic here on the side is just looking at if we put in or what our volume growth would be relative to different treatments and relative to a no treatment. So the solid white bar is on the where it says C, that's a control, so no fertilization was applied. And then we have a 2 and a 4, and that was 200 pounds of nitrogen to the acre and 400 pounds of nitrogen to the acre. And then if it's a white bar, it's alive. If you see the little kind of hashed dark color on the top of the bars, that is dead. So that's the kind of the mortality that we were observing following, say, treatments. And what we are quickly realizing when we were doing this is not all regions responded similarly. And I think I'd also like to point out at this time, this is 1980. This is really pre-GPS, pre-GIS, pre all these wonderful data layers we have access to relative to soils through the Surgo data or climate layers through Climate NA. We really didn't have a very adequate way of stratifying landscape to try to account for variability in those features. And so we were defaulting to things like region. Are we in North Idaho? Are we in Montana? Are we in Central Idaho, Northeast Oregon? And we quickly realized that that was a non-starter, partly because we realized that there's other dynamics going on within region. And you have different parent materials, you have different topographic positions, you have the whole elevational gradients that mitigate your temperature and moisture regimes. And so we saw, okay, we need to dive in a little bit more. And particularly when we saw some very strong negative responses to nitrogen additions. And this was kind of a surprise to us at that time, was not increasing nitrogen actually might be a bad thing. And you can see that in Northeast Washington. I'll try to get my mouse. What you'll see is we added more nitrogen. We have a response, but look at the mortality response. What's going on there? In other words, the very thing that we were trying to prevent, we were causing. So why? And why would we get such a response that not, putting more nitrogen on is not always best? Well, we were realizing quickly that nitrogen can actually exacerbate insect and disease outbreaks in some of our regions. We are seeing our malaria root rots take off with nitrogen additions, high. Now, let me say this, high nitrogen additions, something greater than 400 pounds of nitrogen to the acre. And that was primarily in Douglas fir and some of our other mixed conifer species. When we got into ponderosa pine, we were seeing pine beetle outbreaks. And some of our side research to this was we were increasing the sugar to phenol ratios in the root bark. And so those sugars are what our fungal and our beetle insects and disease are attacking and utilizing. And so we were actually creating some situations where we were exacerbating that. And so we had two things that really came out of this study is, all right, we need to know more about what's going on within region by site type. And we need to understand a little bit more of how these nutrition characteristics of our soil parent material is mitigating or modifying what we are hypothesizing should be these responses to our nutrient additions. And so there was actually some work being done by Webster and Dabowski over on the west side, and they were finding this interesting correlation between potassium limitations in Douglas fir following his fertilizer trials. And essentially what this was a ratio. And that ratio was if they were less than 6,000 parts per million of potassium in the foliage, and or you had this K-end ratio of less than 50%, we were seeing a no response to nitrogen application. We are also seeing that depending on that potassium, it had a strong impact on your mortality response. And so what we were seeing is on sites with moderate to good potassium to nitrogen ratios or high potassium content in the foliage, our mortality was often less than what we were observing in our other or poor sites. And we're noticing this across a range of different soil paramaterials. We were noticing that really this potassium status was almost a proxy for what parent material we were on. And hence there was a term that was generated at that time. It was called good rocks, bad rocks. And of course, our geology friends at that time chuckled at that, or actually they took offense at that at the time. And they said, well, are there good trees and bad trees? And we said, we'll neither confirm nor deny that. But it led to that stage in our research development that we realized, all right, not only do we have to look at our region, we have to look at our climate, we also have to look at our subsurface characteristics, our geology, our soil parent materials. This led to our forest health trials in the 90s to the early 2000s. And this was a true site type by multi-nutrient rate study. In other words, we wanted to look at things just other than just nitrogen. And we wanted to look at it across of precipitation by temperature gradients. We also wanted to look at it across a range of parent materials. And you can see this graphic for the inland Northwest about our regional geology. It's quite diverse, particularly when you get into the northern tiers of Idaho, Western Montana, and Northeast Washington. We have glacial deposits, we have metasedimentary soils, we have sedimentary soils, we have calcium-bearing sedimentary and metasedimentary soils. Oftentimes, you'll see several of these all within one soil pit. On top of all this, we have aeolian deposits such as loess and volcanic ash from Crater Lake when it erupted around 7,500 years ago, all with very different soil physical and chemical characteristics. And so as you can imagine, this was, we had to try to stratify the landscape to best control for the variability that these are going to introduce. And at that time, again, really before we had availability of large fine resolution raster layers of climate, we would default to things like vegetation series and habitat type to help stratify based for kind of the climatic effects, because our vegetation has they integrate those conditions. And so we developed a study guide. Oops, I getting ahead of myself a little bit there. We were developing this research to look at how these plant communities by these rock types play when it comes to response to these different multi-nutrients. And just here's a picture that was shared with us from Reed Lewis. He's with the Idaho Geological Survey here at the University of Idaho. And when we first start talking about good rocks, bad rocks, he says, well, we've known that for a long time. And he sent us this picture. And this is up in here in North Idaho. We have all these metasedimentary beds, and you can kind of see this in this picture up here, this green, this kind of like lime green layer is all these metaseds. And what are metaseds? Essentially, they're just these beds of sediment of varying grain size that were laid down within this inland sea, essentially, that was up here in northwestern Montana, northern Idaho, and northeast Washington. And over time, they are buried and then metamorphosed and then uplifted and then essentially turned on their edge. And that's what kind of formed a lot of the mountain ranges in this region. And as these surfaces weathered and formed soil, what happens is, what's really cool about this is you can actually see banding based on the vegetation. So these arrows are pointing out argillite siltite bands, and guess what's growing in those banded beds of argillite siltite, which is just clay and silt-sized grain sizes that when they weather, that's the kind of the texture of the soil that develops from that. And then look at the bare or the kind of the shrub grassland interbeds between those argillite siltite beds. Guess what those are? That's quartzite. And as you can well imagine, quartz is glass. Plants, particularly conifers, don't grow well in soils that don't develop a good rooting depth, have coarse fraction texture, which just means it's not going to hold water. And then you put it on a west slope or a south sloping aspect in this region, and essentially goodbye forest. Essentially, it's going to have that impact. So not only has it has low nutrition, it also has low water holding capacity. So we were on to something at that point with our geology friends. So we put into this forest health trial between the mid 90s to the early 2000s. And essentially this table looks at how we binned up our sites across this region by our different parent materials. Our granites, which would be your intrusive rock types, our basalts, which would be our extrusive. So these are coarser textured soils here with granitics. Basalts would be your finer clay textured soils. Then we have our metamorphic rocks. These would include our metasedimentary soils, and then our mixed. And typically this mixed categories are glacial. It's just a jumble. It's hard to really define what parent material because it's composed of many different kinds. And then these were crossed with our different vegetation series. We're using a Douglas fir, which would be your lower elevation, warmer, drier. Your grand fir vegetation series, so a little bit more mid elevation, cooler, wetter. And then of course your higher elevation or just your cool, moist sites. And then these are just some surface or response level trials and the number of them that we put in. We had a nitrogen potassium response surface, a nitrogen rate trial, a repeated nitrogen trial. We had some micro rates looking at sulfur and boron and copper and molybdenum and zinc. Anyways, it was just a nice trial that was designed to try to tease out the effect of moisture and our rock types on our growth and mortality in this region. And it's hard to summarize that all up into one graphic, but we'll just use this as kind of an overload graphic. But all this is really saying is we were able through this to identify what we call growth multipliers and mortality multipliers relative to what species or what vegetation series we were in, so what climatic regime we were in, by our different rock types. So we're on basalts, we're on glacial mixed soils, we're on granitics, we're on metasedimentary. And we could do that by different rates of fertilizer. And then we could then see how does our low potassium sites versus our high potassium sites perform in mortality. And so we can look at that then by rates of nitrogen. What you'll notice is across this that yes, more nitrogen you put out, that's great. There is a declining input or effect of nitrogen as you increase your rates, and part of that decline is because you're going to increase some of your mortality. What's interesting is some of our results are early results that said, hey, you're on a high K site, you're going to have low mortality. Well, heck, over here, when we put in our high K sites, we're actually getting some mortality with high rates of N. But what and whether or not you put in potassium or not. So I think what happened was in those early days, what we were finding with that nitrogen potassium interaction was we had limited sites. We only had a couple of sites on parent materials that were not reflecting the entire condition across. It's a little bit more nuanced. It's a little bit more complex than that. And so as we are diving through this, we are finding that essentially it's a little bit more complex, that we needed to define our parent materials. And the parent materials were really, or those KN ratios and potassium status were really proxies for other physiochemical characteristics of the soil parent material. It was really a proxy. And that when we start diving into what those other variables were, that's where some of our relationships started to get a little bit more stronger and a little bit more nuanced in regards to their response. But through this whole forest health trial, we were able to understand the impact of water availability, not only from a climatic perspective, but also some of our surficial deposits. In fact, we'll thank all the West Siders from, if anybody is from or knowledgeable of that Southern Oregon region with Crater Lake, we got all the good ash, all the fine textured volcanic ash in this region. We wouldn't have the level of productivity or forest health in this region if it wasn't for volcanic ash. That soil holds water In fact, in a lot of our management guidelines, we say really be careful on our volcanic ash soils because they really have an impact on the quality and health of our forests. So we were able to really start to define this whole rock type by superficial parent material and its impact not only on growth and mortality, but we're also starting to understand how you need to have care when you're putting these nutrients out, that if you are going to be susceptible to things like armillaria root rots or bark beetles, that more nitrogen is not good unless you start adding some other micros or some other nutrients in there. And if you're on metasedimentary soils, particularly quartzite, you better be very careful about how you want to approach that from a nutrient mitigation perspective, because those soils are our problem spot over on this region. And so over the last 30 years of the IFTNC, essentially we were able to then publish our nutrient limitations by these different rock types and climatic regimes. And what was really cool was we were able to find foliar indices that we can then take anywhere in this region and define what its nutrient deficiencies are, and then target fertilization prescriptions to those particular landscapes to try to alleviate those deficiencies. And through that, we were able to write management guidelines for every major rock type and superficial deposit in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. And after completion of that, so we worked with the Rocky Mountain Research Station and those involved in the Forest Vegetation Simulator program, and we were able to incorporate a lot of this research into a keyword called fertilize, particularly if you use the Inland Empire variant. And so it was a very productive first 30 years. And through those times, as you could well imagine, the price of fertilization would ebb and wane. And towards the end of this, we all know what happened in 2007 and 2008 with the Great Recession. Everybody stopped doing nutrition work and or fertilization. And our members at that time said, okay, we've pushed that research envelope as far as we are willing to take it at this point. It's time to move on to other silvicultural research. And that's when we transitioned to what we call the Intermountain Forestry Co-op. And this Intermountain Forestry Co-op, reason we dropped tree nutrition is essentially this is building on the legacy of examining site type effects, particularly our soils and our geology on forest health and growth. And we want to start looking at, now we have stands, how do we want to define our silvicultural strategies to alleviate the nutrient and water deficiencies that we can observe depending on our site types and our stand densities, and how can we do that through things like slash mitigation or retention and or our stand density management. We're also looking at how can we best understand genetics and their impact on regeneration, growth, and survival. So that spearheaded a whole host of different site type initiatives in this region, all of which are ongoing. We have our slash management that started in 2006, our forest carrying capacity that started in 2011, our density management in 2014, and right now we kicked off a realized gain trial. I'm just going to go through a slide for essentially each of those to kind of describe where we're at in those. Our first one is looking at slash management. And a lot of this is very similar to the work by Connie Harrington's group on the west side, looking at slash retention on the future forest growth. Essentially, we're looking at whole tree versus bole only versus no slash retention, crossed with vegetation control or no vegetation control. And this is a long-term study, and we will be publishing, I think, our 10-year results for all sites in this particular region here in 2023 or 2024. We'll have 10-year data on everything. Again, we are looking at not only these kind of slash retention and or veg treatments, we are looking at this across a range of soil productivity. So sites with ash caps versus no ash caps, and seeing how that also has an impact on growth and survival following regeneration. More recently, we've been working on developing forest carrying capacity models for this region. And this does include west side. This is just not an east side model. We worked with Region 6 Forest Service and the FIA data program to build a comprehensive model across the entire region. And essentially, we're trying to identify what is the carrying capacity across this region and using SDI max. And in the past, SDI max has been species specific. It's been termed site invariant, and that's been proven incorrect. We have several papers on that if you're interested to pursue that a little further, but essentially we were able to develop these SDI max GIS layers for the entire region, depending on your species mix, depending on your site type. So these are site type driven, so climate factors, topographic factors, geologic parent material factors, and through that, we've developed a macro that you can then target a particular density for given the constraints of any particular site. So we're pretty excited about that. And here's those two papers that we published. We have a forestry data applications tool that we've developed. If we have time after this talk, I can do a little quick overview of what that might be. But we're developing these forestry data applications for our members across the region. We have some tools that are coming on as our research matures, but right now this forest carrying capacity calculator is online and available for our members to use. We're also, don't go there, Kimsey, yet. All right, density management. One of the things that now that we know what our carrying capacity is across the landscape, how do we then build stands that reflect that carrying capacity? And so we installed around 300 different density manipulation plots across the region, from Southern Oregon all the way up to the Canadian border. And these are designed to assess side effects on species response to thinning relative to those initial densities by site characteristics. And we're using things like machine learning, gradient boosted methodologies to try to tease out site effects or environmental data, as well as stand and tree data. And this little table graphic is just looking at some of our most recent analysis that shows that if you rely only on stand or tree data, your assessment of growth, that's what this crop tree stand volume growth is, you're only going to predict about 65% of the variability in your responses. You include environmental data in there, you can get up to 85%. These are not your typical models, and this is so I just had to do that because when I was doing this work, I'm so used to growing up on parametric linear models that when we start doing gradient boosted methodology, it kind of blows your mind a little bit. But what it does is it allows us to start teasing out not only the stand conditions, but the site conditions that are influencing response to treatments. And in particular, in this case, some thinning regimes. How are we manipulating density? What are the variables that are important in looking at the magnitude of the response to that thinning? And what could those be, both from a stand and a site characteristic? And so what we're noticing is we're seeing these trends that make sense. But what's really interesting is a lot of these climate variables that are popping into our models are the shoulder season. Here's January, here's February. It's not growing season for us over here on this region because most of our growing season is droughty. So it's really important what's going on in the shoulder seasons. It's in your fall and your winter and early spring that's actually driving some of our responses to our thinning regimes. And so we can look at it not only from, say, a crop tree perspective, we can look at it from a whole stand perspective. What are those drivers? And what's really cool is to see not only kind of the stand level responses that we're seeing across this, but we're seeing these thresholds. And these were these giant jumps happen within the data that we're starting to see these thresholds, whether or not it's our precipitation regimes, in this case, it's in February, or our water holding capacity. So this is a soils factor that's playing a role. Really interesting work that's coming out of this. It's somewhat early. This is just 4-year or 6-year data. We're really excited to see this long term because we're tracking this for 30 years. And so we're hopeful that these patterns will really pop in and really give us some strong predictors of what's going on across the landscape. And I know in the interest of time and some questions, I'm just going to end it here real quick. We have one other trial that we're working on. We just initiated it. It's a realized gain trial. Interestingly enough, over here on the east side, even though we've been having first gen improved seed for many decades, we still have just progeny trials. We have no operational field trials to assess what is the gain from our woods run in our improved seed relative to just our traditional woods run. And we also wanted to look at how does that change from a seed source? If we want to move a lower elevation to a higher elevation, both woods run and improved, how do they perform relative to that native seed zone woods run or improved seed? So we're installing this trial across this region, all the way from the Klamath Siskiyous to the Northern Rocky Mountains. We're growing seedlings, woods run and improved stock for 2 different seed zone elevations here, our Pitkin Nursery, and we're outplanting them. And so our first run's going in right now across this region. This is just a kind of an illustration of our different characteristics of what we're looking at and see what how they impact both growth and mortality in these younger stands. So here's the process we're going through. And essentially, and just in summary, the co-op, what are we? We're a life cycle silviculture research program. We want to answer these questions. How does site influence stand development? How can we optimize silvicultural approaches to maintain and improve our forest health and productivity? And really at the root of it all, it's if we can understand not only the past and the current conditions, we can start to understand, given projected climate changes, how site by stand dynamics need to be assessed to target treatments that promote these resilient future forests. So it's an exciting time to be in research. It's growing the future, and we're excited to be a part of it. And with that, Elijah, I'll stop and turn it over to you if there's any questions.
Okay, we have time for one quick question, and I'll then want to transition to the next speaker, but I have an actual question, so I will post it in the chat for you to answer, Mark, after David begins his presentation. But the one question we have for you is, if you or your collaborators have explored the utility of the Soil Productivity Index derived from soil taxonomic classifications produced by MSU and U.S. Forest Service collaborators that has now been mapped nationwide using SSURGO.
We've actually developed our own. We have looked at it. Part of it is a lot of our region doesn't have Surgo. And so we rely a lot on our geology layers and what we can get from the soil survey. We've actually developed our own matrix. It's a combination of what available data we have on soil texture, its availability on depth restrictive layer, and then all our research that we've done on our geologies relative to their nutrition capability. And we can have an integrative metric that puts all 3 of those together. And that's what we use in our analysis. Yep. And to David Diaz's point on algorithms with GBM, absolutely. So there's a tuning mechanism you can use to try to optimize that. So absolutely, that's part of the whole process. And what are the benefits of machine learning relative to the models we're developing is nature is nonlinear. And the days of using, even semi-parametric methods like geographically weighted regression, it just can't get at the nuance that machine learning can do. And particularly, it's helpful when you have data sets that may be incomplete or impartial that sometimes parametric data sets or methods struggle with. So it's opening up a whole new way of looking at our data.
Well, thanks, Mark. I really appreciate you giving us this talk and taking a little time out for your defense.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Super interesting. And of course, if anyone has any other questions, please just throw them into the comments. Otherwise, I'm going to switch over to our next speaker, who is David Diaz. He is the Director of Forest Technology and Analytics at the nonprofit EcoTrust, where he works on integrating open source data and methods to produce actionable, user-friendly tools for forest management. And today he's here to talk to us about one of those tools. So David, I'm just going to hand it right over to you.
All right. Thanks, Elijah. Can you see my screen and hear me coming in all right? Okay. Well, really appreciate the opportunity to share some of the work we've been doing for the past couple of years with all of you, and excited to dive in. So this is work that's been supported in my capacity at EcoTrust, but also as a PhD student at the University of Washington. So let's go ahead and dive in. So a lot of this work got motivated originally by a web application that I was brought on to EcoTrust maybe 7-8 years ago to lead that we produced called Forest Planner, which was a scenario planning tool. And over several years of outreach and engagement, primarily with family forest owners, but also with consulting foresters and extension agents, we kept finding a recurring bottleneck in the use of more advanced scenario planning capabilities, and that most of the landowners we were engaging were actually not like scenario planning was way beyond what they were trying to accomplish at that moment. And I think it was a good lesson learned about the importance of user-centered design, that we've kind of learned the lesson the hard way. But a lot of the landowners that we were interacting with couldn't get to the point of identifying the forest types and filling out a stand table for the forest types on their properties. And so that basically hamstrung them from being able to access, well, what would happen if I managed a forest like this way or that way? And so the kind of broader utility of Forest Planner was really limited to the small subset of family forest owners that had already collected inventory or had it summarized in a way that they could enter it very easily in a form like this. So we wanted to address that bottleneck with a precursor intervention. And so this has been supported for about the past 5 years, starting with a couple of Oregon NRCS Conservation Innovation Grants. And that helped us kind of pursue this kind of proof of concept. And we're currently operating under a multi-year grant from the USDA Western SARE research and education program. And we have a pretty big co-production committee, and we're focused on, in particular, doing this forest stand delineation work as part of the land mapping effort. And we've had a variety of foundations and agencies and collaborators supporting us throughout this process that I want to acknowledge as well. But before diving in too much further, I want to kind of give you a quick tour of Land Mapper. And hopefully you can kind of see that landing page for it now. So right now, Land Mapper covers all of Oregon. And to actually load the maps, it's going to take a minute or two. So just kind of want to give you a quick demo of what that looks like while I kind of can unpack some of what's going on behind the scenes while we do that. So we can just pick an example location here. So let's go down to Grants Pass, Oregon. This can take addresses or GPS coordinates and things like that. And basically it's designed that you could come over, navigate to a tax lot, select it, give it a name, and then create maps, and it'll give you the spinning wheel. And so while that's loading, I'll switch back to talking about what's actually happening behind it. So a big part of what's happening behind it is a lot of collaboration. So in our Western SARE project, like I mentioned, we're following a co-production process where we have a large project team where I, Nils Christopherson, Greg Edel, and Kirk Hansen are co-PIs on this research and education grant. And we're bringing support from a lot of other folks at our organizations and other collaborating organizations with folks that have pretty diverse expertise. And we're also supported by a co-production advisory team that includes family forest owners and consulting foresters. Colin is a tribal forester, Sherry is with a land trust, Nate and Andrew are with ODF and NRCS, and Lauren is an OSU extension forester. And so we kind of appreciated from the outset that a lot of this forest planning, forest mapping, stewardship planning work had a lot of different touch points, and that there were different potential applications for it that we needed to bake in a formal process. Also, doing a much broader user research and user needs assessment that is ongoing at this point. As it relates to what I'm going to spend most of the time talking about today, I want to talk about this task of identifying and labeling forest stands. and how we've been approaching that from kind of a data science or forest inventory and assessment perspective, without having to step foot on the ground as a first pass. And so the first aspect of this was that we wanted to come up with reproducible forest types. So this is surprisingly difficult. In particular, the forest composition, classifying forest composition is a mess, and there's 1,000,001 different ways to do it. And a lot of the ones that are used in academic or research applications have way too many types of communities to be practically useful in a small landowner planning context. So we ended up landing on a forest classification scheme that was adopted for the Oregon Conservation Plan, Oregon Conservation Strategy developed by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, that basically condenses all of the diverse forest conditions across Oregon into 14 major forest types. And so it's a more manageable number that have intuitive names, that foresters on the ground would probably use when describing what they're looking at as well. And that also gives us the benefit of being able to crosswalk when we predict a forest community type. It can translate directly into habitat suitability as well, which is another aspect that's not currently in Land Mapper, but there's a recurring interest that we hear from landowners and their service providers. So the other aspects that kind of go into a basic stewardship plan are also knowing the cover class, canopy cover class, and diameter class of the trees in the stand. And so we borrowed from some pretty standard, classification schemes that are, described here by Forest Service researchers, but they're also reproduced in a variety of other management plan templates in both Oregon and Washington. And so we'll end up with a label that looks something like this, a community type, a size class, and a cover class. And I also want to highlight that the threshold that we're trying to hit here is different from what you might think of as precision forestry, right? So we're not trying to map every, individual tree level mapping across the United States. That's not what we're trying to do. We are trying directly to kind of address this need of non-industry private landowners and stewardship planning and generating maps that can accelerate that bottleneck that we see foresters and landowners spending days or weeks gathering data from dozens of websites or going into local offices to copy and paste things. All right, so how did we approach this? Thankfully, there's lots of very smart and dedicated people from several agencies around the region that have been collecting thousands and thousands of plots over the past several years with the explicit purpose of predicting things on the ground based on things that you can see from the sky. And so we went and gathered these data from Forest Service, BLM, and DNR. We also are using stand level inventory data collected by ODF and DNR and Forest Service as well. That's not represented here. But what was particularly compelling about this was that these were very confidently located plots with their locations disclosed, unlike FIA, and that each of these agencies didn't at that point in time actually intend to use the data from the others, to inform their processes. And so I looked at this and said, oh my gosh, this is a machine learning dream. You've got thousands of data from diverse ecoregions, across the Pacific Northwest. And a lot of the precursor research to this, looking at individual research forests and the transferability of these models, really was limited just by having a couple hundred plots that were collected within a single research forest, and so this was kind of a unique opportunity to try to go region-wide and develop models that could do that. And this is not new. We've seen methodologies like this rolled into land fire and the gradient nearest neighbor approach that's come out of OSU. And so we've kind of got very tall shoulders that we can stand on and build from with new data like these, with new observations like these, but also with new remote sensing data that's become available since a lot of those methods first emerged. And so the first was that we had LiDAR data that we could use. And so we have these unique plots, that were observed by these agencies across the different ecoregions. And then we have LiDAR acquisitions that are kind of a patchwork over time. We only use publicly accessible LiDAR acquisitions from a variety of different sources. But so you can see here that we have some, when we look at the number of plots or number of observations that we can use for a particular ecoregion, it's more than the number of unique plots. And what that reflects is the fact that we can have multiple LiDAR passes over time of the same plot. And we don't want to treat it only where we look at we don't want to ignore the fact that we have a pretty good idea what's on that plot, even if the LiDAR came a year later or came 2 years later. And so there's some QA/QC, that we went through to kind of figure out whether or not that's worth, combining LiDAR data from before or after a plot was measured, that we can talk about. But so we end up with several thousand, plots that intersect with LiDAR over this time span. And then we also wanted to compare this with satellite data. So obviously the benefit of satellite data is that it's wall to wall every year. So unlike LiDAR data, we can actually generate maps across an entire state every year. And so we really wanted to figure out, is the satellite data that we have good enough? And so we're focusing on using satellite imagery available from the Sentinel-2 constellation, but also supplementing that with Landsat as well. I'll describe on the next slide. But so we have a more recent time slice that we're looking at to kind of build training examples for. So what we actually try to do here, we've got the LiDAR data where we got the footprints for all the plots and calculated cloud metrics using Fusion. For satellite imagery, we got Sentinel-2 from Google Earth Engine, and we're using image composites from both leaf-on and leaf-off periods for that. And then we're also using the land trender implementation on Google Earth Engine to calculate time since disturbance, magnitude of disturbance, and the duration of disturbance as well. And so this is building that kind of Star Wars, length list of features that go into our regression models that we can play with. And in terms of figuring out what we're trying to predict, we take plot level attributes of canopy cover, dominant height, QMD, stand density index, cubic volume, and above ground biomass. We also have a rating that's a hardwood softwood abundance as kind of a hardwood dominated to conifer dominated or softwood dominated that we're using as well. And to fill in these gaps, right? We have these observations that were at a single point in time. So we grow those plots forward on an annual time step using the appropriate regional variant of the forest vegetation simulator. And then we throw out plots where we see a wide divergence between the canopy cover or the height that we saw with LiDAR and the plot, or that we saw if we saw a land trender indicated disturbance between the time that the plot was observed and the time that we were trying to match it up with remote sensing data. So that culled a fair amount of the training observations. And then I'm not going to dive into all of these right now in much detail in the presentation, but we explored a bunch of different kinds of models to fit here. So we had 2 linear models that were regularized using what's called lasso regression or elastic net regression. And those are basically ways that you can still build a linear model, but penalize the inclusion of lots of variables. So it's kind of letting the model do the variable selection for you, but still imposing a linear structure on the model that is ultimately produced. And then we had some of the different flavors of machine learning algorithms that are still not quite getting to computer vision approaches, like neural networks and convolutional nets, but looking at k-nearest neighbor, random forest, and gradient boosting machines to figure that out. We also set this up in a way to try and do what's called chained regression. And so what I mean by that is that we feed this raw data into the model and it predicts canopy cover. And then it takes the raw remote sensing data and the prediction of canopy cover to predict dominant height. And then it takes the raw remote sensing data, the prediction of canopy cover, the prediction of dominant height to predict QMD. And you get the pattern. And so we also, recognizing the question I raised with Mark in his presentation as well, that, oftentimes we see presentations of these models that's just like, we trained a random forest model, and it's not really clear how they tuned it or how well those models perform and generalize. And so we spent a lot of time figuring out how to impose a nested cross-validation to where we're not necessarily evaluating the predictive performance of a specific tuned version of gradient boosting machines or random forest, but we're saying, how well does a tuned algorithm perform? How well does a tuned random forest perform? With the expectation that eventually what we're going to do is we're going to train that model on all the available data that we have and apply it in real time And we just want to know how concerned should we be about how well it generalizes, given what we've tuned. And so we did a bunch of experimentation around what data we allowed the models to see, so we could figure out how much information is being gained when you let a model see a new ecoregion, for example. And I'm not going to get too much into that, in the rest of the presentation, but happy to chat about it in Q&A. And so what we looked at here, we're seeing the LiDAR, one of the best performing LiDAR models, which was random forest, using all of the data across all of the ecoregions, and looking at the target variables we were trying to predict. And you've got the observed, value on the X and the predicted value on the Y. And for canopy cover and QMD, these are, these bands indicate the thresholds, basically, where we said, is this good enough for being used in a stewardship plan? Where can we predict within one canopy cover class, or can we predict with one diameter size class? And the bottom row is the satellite performance. And the best performing algorithm we had for that was gradient boosting machines that were fed all of the data from around the regions, and then tested on held out data from all of the regions. And so we saw a pretty similar pattern that many of you have probably seen before when you look at remote sensing data. When you look at, for example, QMD or stand density or cubic volume or biomass, that there's a saturating pattern that happens. So a lot of these models tend to underpredict structural attributes when you're at the high end of the range. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But we also see overprediction at the low end of the range. But by and large, we found, I don't want to spend a lot of time on these tables, but if you want, I'm sure we'll make these slides available so you can dig in, and we're preparing publications for this as well. But this is showing the average prediction error for each of the variables and 3 of the different algorithms that we use, whether they were trained with LiDAR or satellite. And so in general, we were predicting things within a 20 to 35% error with linear models. When we got to the machine learning models, we were seeing that same kind of performance, but also with the satellites. But generally, we saw what you would expect was that the LiDAR data gives you more precision for predicting some of these attributes than the satellites. But when we look at the scale, what we saw was on average, for example, with our machine learning models, that the difference between how well we were predicting was not significant in terms of utility. I'm not talking about statistical significance, but not significant in terms of utility for stewardship planning. And so we came to the conclusion that the satellite models, the benefit of being able to map across the entire state, on an annual basis, outweighed, focusing on using LiDAR data in only the subset of areas that you could get it. And this is showing the mean absolute error for each of these prediction variables with the different data sources and algorithm types as well. All right, so what does it look like? So here's some examples where we start with some of the leaf-on imagery from Sentinel. We also feed in elevation, like I said, time since disturbance, and we have a land cover classifier model that we built as well. And we predict things like canopy cover, dominant height, above ground biomass, and land cover. And those all kind of get smashed together to produce forest type maps. So here's another condition where we're looking at a drier forest system. And we see similar patterns where we're picking up pretty well some of the patterns that are happening across the landscape. And here's an example of an area that has had this, no significant large scale disturbance for a long time. And we can see the patterns across the landscape emerging in terms of the height of the trees and the biomass are still coming out in a way that makes intuitive sense. And so how do we get from pixels to stands? We re-implemented a process called size constrained region merging. This is the full workflow that was proposed by Castilla and colleagues a while back. And we follow, basically, we jump in at this stage instead. So a lot of this was designed to use higher resolution imagery. And when we're using 10-meter resolution Sentinel and predicted forest structure attributes from that, we're already starting at a coarse enough resolution that we don't need to get in much detail in these stages. But we do then go from pixels to superpixels. so that each superpixel is clustered to be a quarter of an acre. And this SLIC is basically k-means implemented in a spatial context. So it's like k-means clustering, but also considers XY position. And then SCRM, or size-constrained region merging, is a graph-based, rule-based merging system that imposes minimum mappable units, a desired average size, and a maximum size. And then we rasterize the stand boundaries. So this is what it looks like. We take the, I visualized it using the imagery, even though what's actually being clustered are the forest type attributes that we're predicting and not the pixel values for the imagery. But so we end up going from this 10-meter resolution to something that's a little blurred through that slick superpixel process. And then we go through size-constrained region merging to generate what I'm calling rough stands here. So these are the stands that satisfy the minimum mappable unit, desired maximum size and mean average size of units across the landscape. And we see it's picking up boundaries pretty well. I'm not particularly happy with the blockiness of the boundaries, which we'll talk about, but there we are. And so we can end up summarizing the cover class, the size class, and the forest community class from that, which we're drawing from the predictions that were made by Portland State Institute for Natural Resources folks, and smashing those all together to where we can come up with stands that dissolve the boundaries between units that have the same type. So if we have two stands that are next to each other that are Douglas fir, Western hemlock, moderate cover, small tree, we merge them together and dissolve the boundary between them. And we end up with a map that ends up looking like this. And this is what we can report in Forest Planner. So I'm running low on time at this point. So I want to just take a quick step back to Land Mapper. And so you can see what it looks like. So a lot of the work that went into Land Mapper was not initially about forest mapping at all, but getting these basic maps that go into a forest management plan. And a lot of things that are basically go to this website and look something up. So we're doing a lot of that behind the scenes to gather the attributes that go into a stewardship plan, such as gathering your aerial photo, gathering a street map that shows your property in relation to neighboring communities and how to access the property, gathering your terrain map, gathering your streams map using the typing under Oregon Forest Practices and produced by ODF, looking at the soil type map and giving you a description of the soils. And then also what we're producing now is this forest type map. And so I want to say this is like version 0.1, of the forest type maps, and is definitely kind of a work in progress. But we do the same thing where we produce these forest type descriptions here. And so it's a pretty simple tool, in terms of compared to something like Forest Planner. But there's a lot going on under the scenes, and we're really hoping that this can actually accelerate the stewardship planning process, and would love to get some of y'all's feedback on that. So just wrapping up then, I'm going to skip through some of my reflections here, but basically to say, this is hard. Like the stand delineation itself feels much more like art than it does like science. And actually trying to cast that as a quantification problem in a machine learning context has been really difficult. And I'm happy to unpack that more. But we're also running into a real world situation that the landowner really matters and what they want to do really matters. And a lot of landowners and foresters have this attitude of, I'm going to draw a new stand layer anyways. So I think there's an important recognition of like where to meet the users in this process and what type of data you can provide them to shorten this planning cycle. So I will pause there, and this is how you can reach me.
Great. All right. Thank you, David. Does anyone have any questions at all? Nice. Nice. Well, again, the fact that you mentioned machine learning just as Mark did it, I mean, it sounds like that this new technology, or we're still on the edge of what this technology can do for forestry modeling work and satellite work. Is that kind of a fair assessment?
I think so. I mean, I think I also do a lot of growth and yield modeling, and I think that's an area, I think it's better suited for certain purposes than it is for others. And when you're dealing with a problem like interpolation, like mapping something wall to wall when you have scattered observations across a landscape, machine learning is really well suited for that. When you deal with extrapolation, like in the context of trying to predict how forests are going to respond in the context of a changing climate and changing management, that's a scenario where you have to be very careful with the machine learning models to make sure that they're not overfitting, and that you're focusing more on how they can generalize basic behaviors. And so that's actually an area where I still think there's an underappreciation for mechanistic models, and just improving the usability of mechanistic models to fit big data sets. And so I think there's lots of exciting work going on there. But as it relates to mapping from satellites, like you're drowning in data,
Nice.
raw data. And so machine learning models are perfect for something like that.
Nice. Nice. All right. Looks like Elijah, you have a question?
Yeah, you were talking about, and maybe I missed this, but you're talking about stand delineation, looking for ways to improve it. This is something I've been thinking about a lot for my own job, because becoming a whole thing is, have you looked at using like the underlying landform to help classify that out somewhere, like aspect, ridge lines, sort of that natural landform stand boundaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, we've kind of dipped our toes in, and I think similar to the Star Wars scroll, like the real challenge here is trying to figure out and recognize that each landowner is going to use different conditions to delineate what is a management unit for them. And so a lot of that has to do with things that, for a lot of folks, having a road, coming through is likely to be a stand boundary. But if you're managing a 20-acre, area, you might have a lot more, delineations with that. And if you're managing a couple 100 acres, you might not, And so there's a lot of things that, really trade off like that, where we're trying to figure out where's the sweet spot where you can try to serve as many people with as little additional work as possible. And the jury's still out, in terms of how much to invest in the automated delineation process versus getting something close to that might be like, here's patches, that are not as big as stands, that are 1/4 acre, 1/2 acre, 1 acre, blobs of forest conditions that look similar, and then allow the user to actually figure out, how do I merge those together into management units, if that makes sense. And so that's where recognizing that property boundaries are a big deal, streams are a big deal, watersheds are a big deal, but each management context is going to treat those boundaries differently or put a higher priority on one or the other. So navigating that has been, as much, like I said, art as it is science. But I do feel like there's, we have been digging a little bit deeper into approaching this problem from instead of having this do pixel-based prediction, then merge the pixels together, this is more of kind of like a quote unquote old-fashioned, but old-fashioned I mean like early 2000s to mid 2000s, approach of computer vision. And we now have a lot of these models that have been developed and advanced by smarter and better paid people than foresters, to figure out how cars can recognize when they're about to hit a person, and things like that, where it's a black box, but basically it does one shot and tells you, here's a blob of something that's distinguishable from the stuff around it, and here's a label for it. So I think the real challenge in that is, how do you define what's good, in a way that allows a model, a computer like that, to learn from millions and millions of examples? Because we have data to do that. It's just defining the loss function for a neural network like that to learn is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be.
Nice. And what's been the reaction then to private landowners to this new tool?
Yeah, the forest type maps, I'm still getting a lot of constructive criticism, I'll say. But I will say we have lots of consulting foresters and landowners that are reporting back that I can accelerate the planning process and go out and talk with a landowner with maps already in hand. And so you can actually get more quickly to what I think foresters as human beings are better at, which is talking about what people care about, what their management concerns are, and what they want to do about it, as opposed to spending a lot more time at a computer gathering maps. And so I think a lot of the basics of getting the aerial map, the stream map, the topo map, the street map, those are all things that I don't think any forester was like, ooh, I get to spend more time gathering tax lot data or soils data, or asking the landowner to go. I mean, this is something from our extension colleagues that like, they've spent a lot of time teaching landowners to use the NRCS soils website. And it's like, maybe 15% of the landowners actually feel confident about using it by the time they're done, with a workshop, like a dedicated workshop on it. So I think being able to automate some of that, go gather this from that website, we're getting a lot of feedback that this is addressing a real need. But I think the forest type mapping thing is still, there's like recognizing that there's different levels of sophistication for different types of users. There's like multiple targets that we're trying to hit simultaneously. So that's a little bit trickier.
Nice. And you might have already covered this. So what is the timeline then for rolling out? Is it just right now to consulting foresters to test it, or when is it going to go out to, private forest landowners?
Yeah, so right now, Landmapper is publicly available. We launched it in December, a little over a year ago, and gave a tree school presentation about it, tree school online presentation about it. So you can go to landmapper.ecotrust.org right now, go anywhere in Oregon and apply it. And we have tree farm inspectors, for example, that are doing that, on a regular basis already. And as part of our Western SARE grant, a lot of the focus is in particular on the stand delineation process, and if we can make that good enough to be usable. And as part of that, extending this to Washington as well. So that is a 3-year grant. We still have 1 more year left. And with COVID disruptions and some terrible things that have happened in my personal life, it's probably going to be extending for another year beyond that. But so there's more to come for Washington soon. And I really look forward to probably chatting with many of you, about what that should look like.
Nice. All right. Well, make a note of that for the tree farm program. So
Yeah.
reach out to you when it's finally in Washington. So nice. Okay. All right. Well, I think those are all the questions then for David. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, David. I appreciate it. That was a great talk. An interesting tool. I think I'm probably going to end up playing around with it a little bit after the meeting.
Please do.
Okay, so to introduce our next group, we've got 2 student groups, I believe, today from Green River that Monica can introduce for us. Talk to us about benthic macroinvertebrates and how they're affected by beaver dams and dissolved oxygen. So, Monica, I'll pass it over to you if you're ready.
Thank you. Can you hear us here, Green River?
Yes.
Thank you, Elijah. This is a continuation of my students from the stream and restoration ecology class and all of the hard science research that they did while they were in my course. We had a very big amount of students this year doing macroinvertebrates, as you guys have already picked up on. And because of our flooding events, it was a really unique year to do the research. So presenting first today is Alex Chester. And come on up here, Alex, we can see you. Alex did work with Samantha Hazard, Laura Heiberg, and Nick Planner, and they really looked at the impacts that beaver dams have on that aquatic ecosystem and biodiversity. So with that, I'll pass it off to Alex, and I'll come up and introduce the next group when you're ready. So go ahead, Alex.
All right. Thank you very much. So I'm Alex Chester, and we did a study on benthic macroinvertebrates and their correlation to distance from beaver dams. We chose a site east of Enumclaw for its properties of not being as flooded as other beaver dam locations. And so let's get this screen shared and
Is it running?
presentation started.
There you go.
And so we decided to go with benthic macroinvertebrates because they're a very common indicator of stream health. They have an index number associated with them that is based off of their tolerance to pollution. And beaver dams are known for positively impacting insect populations in the area. And so we wanted to see if what kinds of correlation there was between insect population counts and alpha diversity downstream from a beaver dam. And so most studies that have studied these correlations have had three kinds of common plots, either upstream at the beaver dam and downstream, or at 1, 10, and 100 meter increments downstream from the beaver dam. And so our group decided to go with a gradient. So we took 20 plots in a gradient downstream from about 100 to about 150 to 200 feet downstream from a beaver dam. And we did this so that we could see a trend, a continuous trend over time, and see if that matched what other studies were saying were correlated with their distances from beaver dams. And so we hypothesized that there was a correlation, but we weren't sure whether it was going to be a positive or negative one for diversity and counts. And so at these 20 plots, we just took a D-net and we massaged the substrate in for a minute to collect insects, dumped them into a bin, and counted the number of insects in each family that we could find, recorded that data, and ran some like correlation coefficient tests and graphs and whatnot. That's our testing location. And what we found was, while there wasn't very much of a correlation between diversity and distance, there was a slight negative correlation, counts went down a little bit, but mostly there was a correlation between total population counts and specifically the little brown stonefly population counts were very correlated. And so for population counts, it was a correlation coefficient of 0.29, and the little brown stonefly was a correlation coefficient of 0.44. And so those are like pretty moderate correlations, which we thought were interesting. And it's a positive trend. So the farther away from the beaver dam, the higher the counts got. And we thought this is interesting because we were thinking that it might start high at the beaver dam because there's high organic concentration right below the beaver dam, and that might get less as you go farther away. But little brown stoneflies are shredders. They take organic material from the beaver dam, shred it and into smaller pieces, and so organic material gets finer on the way down the stream. And so there may be a correlation there where organic material is more accessible for insect populations, and so that may be a reason that counts are going up, and for just in general and for its own family. And so yeah, so it's interesting because like little brown stoneflies have the lowest tolerance for pollution of all the bugs we found in that area. And so that means that stream specifically is a very like clean, healthy stream. And so yeah, so we yeah. And so that's those were our findings. We think this opens up discussion for like further research on maybe farther down a stream or being able to sample deeper channels, because we were just using D-nets. It would be cool if you could go farther down a channel or deeper into a channel. Those are some directions that the research could go. But yeah, there was a correlation between these counts and distance from a beaver dam throughout the entire gradient of the downstream area. And so, yeah, I can take any questions.
Yes, all right. Just out of curiosity, how long had the beaver dam been there?
I believe it was a fairly old beaver dam. I don't even know if the beavers were there anymore. I'd say what, like 19, was it there? Do you think it was there?
I think in the aerial photos, I think it's been there longer than 10 years.
Longer than 10 years, okay.
Okay. Nice. Okay. And so again, what was the purpose then of kind of what research question were you trying to answer?
Is there a correlation between benthic macroinvertebrate population counts and alpha diversity versus distance from a beaver dam?
Okay. So does that have any implications then for other parts of the stream ecosystem then, and trying to find the answer to that question?
Other stream ecosystem questions. I believe it opens up testing for dissolved oxygen versus like organic material, since organic material tends to be larger, closer to the beaver dam and smaller below because of these shredders. You can do like water quality metrics and see if those change and if there's any correlation between the insect populations as well. And just its effect on the overall stream quality. So you could do this also at other streams that maybe aren't as healthy, and see, like, do a comparison between streams and beaver dams.
Yes, okay. All right, looks like Andy has his hand up.
Thanks, Andrea, and good presentation. I was curious about the land use adjacent to the beaver dams, and the reason why is well, it kind of looked like farmland, for example, from the aerial photo. I wasn't quite sure, or if it was like a very young forest or something like that. And I was curious about phosphorus, which is a limiting factor in freshwater streams, particularly headwater streams, and the productivity. So, you know, there's a tipping point or a balance point, I guess, for the health of a stream and the benefit for things like little salmon. If they can get there, is there going to be any food, which they eat those little brown stoneflies, things like that. So so some phosphorus is good, but you know, everything in moderation, right? So I was curious about the land use and, you know, any types of inputs that may have come from outside of the natural system, from, say, farming.
All right, so land use. This piece of land is owned actually by the Green River College Natural Resource Department. And I'm not sure who owns the land next, like around our land. But it's mostly used for recreation and research for the students. And so it's not really farmland. The forest is fairly old. I don't think it's old growth, but it's pretty, like, we run, I think the most we do is run like chainsaw class out there and do forest management on that end. But otherwise it's mostly for research and isn't touched too much. And so as for phosphorus, the area that we studied, there was a lot of moss everywhere, but the stream itself was mostly grassy. So I'm not sure what phosphorus levels are involved for like a grassy stream, but it was definitely kind of a stream and wetland area. It was pretty flooded because this is right after the 3 inches of rain that we got like a month or two ago. And so some of the channels are pretty deep, but yeah, mostly grass. And yeah, vegetation was pretty limited other than grass. There was trees, but not much algae or anything like that. Did I fully answer your question?
Yeah, that's a good enough picture. Thank you.
Okay.
Is there any interest in going later this year to collect fry, or to count the number of fry in the area that you sampled, to see if there's any, again, if the invertebrate counts also relate then to other numbers of species in the stream?
Interest, yes. Time and experience, I'm not so sure. That I think that would be a very interesting follow-up. I'm not sure what time we would go out. We haven't done too much. We haven't learned too much on like post-larval stage. That may come up, and I'm taking stream restoration this quarter, so maybe later bug stages will be involved, but I'm not sure.
Nice. Okay. Nice. All right. Anyone else have any other questions? Nice. All right. Well, I think that's it. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much. Appreciate the talk. And Monica, I believe you guys have another student presentation lined up. Is that right?
That is correct. Thanks, Alex. By here, we've got a kind of a funny setup in our classroom here. It's a bottleneck. So I'll let Alex migrate and get Sean and Ian up here. Sean Ekman and Ian Paulson are coming to present on a more a bigger drop. They're looking at the impacts of a waterfall, specifically with the change in dissolved oxygen between the top and the bottom of a waterfall, and how that's impacting the stream ecosystem. And so along with Sean and Ian, we have Macy Mackey and Becca Wassam also participated in this research. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you, gentlemen.
We're already sharing screen still?
Yes, you are
Okay, cool,
sharing.
cool.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Ian Paulson. I'm Sean Ekman. And so our study was on top of a waterfall and bottom waterfall, and how differences between benthic macroinvertebrates were affected by that. The location we used for this was up in Eatonville, and we did along the little Michelle River, doing the top between Tom Falls, Little Michelle Falls, and Lower Little Michelle Falls. We were able to complete our studies so that we did 10 plots at the top of the waterfalls and 10 plots at the bottom of the waterfall to see if there was any difference between those. Yeah, but we were just seeing if there was any effect on the species between the top and bottom, or what the effect would be. And so basically our question was whether or not there was a significant difference between the species at the top and bottom, or if just one species was affected by that at all. And so did our plots on that and completed our study on that. Then the methods we used for this, we just did 10 plots at the top of the waterfalls, 10 plots at the bottom, like I said before. And then we also used a DNet to capture the BMIs in shallower parts of the falls, where we could actually touch and move the substrate and capture the bugs, which we then put into 25 quart bins to find and sort the bugs into ice cube trays with fresh water, so we could later identify them and sort them as needed to get our counts. And do our studies. Just trying to figure out if there was any difference between those.
Okay, so as you said, yeah, we went out to the Little Michelle River, sorted through all these bugs. We actually caught quite a few. There was, just through plain numbers in the results, we had a lot more benthic macroinvertebrates at the top of the falls. We had 195 that we were found, whereas at the bottom of the falls, we only found 87. But the interesting part to us here was that we had, and this wasn't exactly what we went out to find, but we ended up finding that obviously there's a lot more dissolved oxygen below the falls. It was actually supersaturated to a point of, with the 2 DO tests that we did, 2 DO tests below the falls and 2 above. And the ones below the falls were at 112.72% and 128.82%. So whereas the ones above the falls were in the high 90s. So it was also rich in dissolved oxygen above, but it wasn't at a supersaturation level. With that being the case, we thought it was interesting because we found there to be a higher richness and evenness in the benthic macroinvertebrates below the falls, whereas there was a higher population above. Now, looking through this, went too far. Looking through this, you can see that just due to the species present and the higher richness and evenness, we thought it could possibly be that there was a.
We've got the wrong poster sharing.
Oh,
Let's do this. There we go.
oh. Well, now that you guys can see what we're doing, that's the falls behind the slides. So I can go back and show you some of that after when we're doing questions and stuff. But yeah, so with the higher richness and evenness below the falls, it got us thinking that it might places that are supersaturated with dissolved oxygen might act as havens for macroinvertebrate species and contribute to higher richness and evenness among them. The Little Michelle River was also in the past, well, one, it flows into the Nisqually, but it's also itself important for steelhead and Chinook salmon populations. And that got us thinking, well, how does dissolved oxygen affect fish? And when you have a supersaturation of dissolved oxygen, it is like below dams and in other situations, it's actually harmful to fish. So they get, I don't remember the exact language, but they get the bubbles. And so then we were thinking, well, if fish fry and like young fish depend on the benthic macroinvertebrates for food, then if there's a higher richness and evenness here, would that how would that affect them based on which ones they prefer, even though there's less below the falls? So then, like, would that cause any sort of issues with them feeding further on? That's kind of where we were with it. I'm not sure there's any other specific numbers, but that was basically what we were thinking, and just overall like stream ecology, like how this influences benthic macroinvertebrates and how it overall affects stream ecology and that sort of thing. But that's pretty much the numbers. That's all of that. But before we do anything else, I want to scroll back up a couple slides. This you can see kind of sort of. It's not huge, but this is the map of where we were. Little Michelle Falls is actually, it's as you said, it's near Eatonville. It's in a park, so it is somewhat protected, and they are trying to make sure that, because they recognize that the river is important for salmon and steelhead populations, they wanted to make sure that there was some preservation work going on there. So yes, I will open it up to questions now.
All right, thank you. Just out of curiosity, how many ice cube trays did you end up going through?
We had two because we did 10 plots above the falls, 10 plots below the falls. So we would do one plot, fill it up, count all of them, maybe get two, depending on how many we had at a time, and then dump them all back out, then go to the next plot and recatch them and so on. So we didn't have to have 12 trains going on
Okay.
at one time. That would have been hard to juggle through a river.
No, I was picturing then going to like Value Village or such and buying a bunch of those old blue and white ice cube trays and bringing them out to the field.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Nice. Is the waterfall by a path at all? Were there like members of the public out there while you were out there sampling to see what you're doing?
Yes, there was. It was right off the trail. It took a little bit to get down there because parts of the trail down to the waterfall had eroded away, and it got to climb down there. We met several hikers along the trail and very interested in what we were doing, and sought to talk to them and explain all that.
It was actually that, like, on one side there was a trail because there was 3 falls and there was a trail going to each of the falls more or less. And then on the other side, not directly next to the river, but in pretty close proximity, there was a road. And then when you got above the top falls where we were, where we did our top sampling, there was actually an old railroad track that was there that went on a bridge over the river. So I'm not sure if that would have any lingering effect now because it's not in use, but it was there once.
Nice, nice. And it's kind of hard to tell from the picture. So how large are or how tall are the falls?
Do you remember off the top of your head? They were tall.
I just remember that one of them was about 90 feet tall. I don't remember about the other ones, but the one of the ones we did was 90 feet tall.
That was the bottom one, wasn't it?
Yeah, the bottom one.
Yeah,
is
the
90.
one pictured here, it's a small picture for
Yeah.
you guys, but the one pictured there is the 90-foot one.
Yes.
This was also during at the same time
Yeah,
Alex was out there. It was during a flood. So it was actually very, very heavily flowing. It's not usually flowing that intensely.
One of our group members has been there before and was very surprised about how fast it was flowing and how high the water was.
Okay. So yeah, so it sounds like then if you were to go out in different times of the year, you might get different results. On the counts?
Possibly go ahead. Yeah, possibly. We really ended up deciding that to get more clear results, so you would want to do further testing, come out in the winter when it was definitely at a supersaturation because of the flooding, then come out in the summer and see if there was the same thing, see if there was still a supersaturation, see if there was the same richness and evenness below the falls and all that.
Nice. Okay. Nice. All right. Looks like Andy has a question.
Yeah, thanks. Good presentation, guys. I'm curious about how long that supersaturation sustained in the water column. And it's, supersaturated water is not a big deal for like a salmon, a baby fish or something like that, as long as they stay down. But when they come up to the surface, it creates the bends, which is what gas bubble trauma comes from. And it's what hydropower tries to avoid on the big rivers. And so when they're spilling a lot of water over the top, they gas up the river, and it takes miles for that and the total dissolved gases. So not just oxygen, but argon, all that other stuff, nitrogen, takes miles for it to go away to where it's actually a kind of a more livable environment. So I was wondering, what difference does it make below the falls? Is there like a 50-yard area or 100 feet or 200 feet?
We were sampling within, mostly because of the flooding conditions, we were sampling within about 100 feet, something like that, below the falls. And we would have gone further, but you couldn't get into the current quite literally. So that's how we had it there. But with the flow that we had at the time, I would think that it would have actually gone on for a little ways, but that is just my guess.
Nice, nice. And so if you had a chance to do this, the study again, are there other questions that you would ask or other data you would collect?
Well, I would like to, I mean, I think we should, if we had more time, it would have been good to go out and get like pollutant levels and other such things to see if like the waterfall filtered it, see how that would work. Sample further down the stream past the waterfall, maybe further up on the other side, just get more data. And possibly sample during different like peak flood season, peak drought season kind of thing to see how that would affect it, because that's really where my questions are, of just how consistent is this and what other factors affect it.
Nice. In this area, are there other falls as well that you could do a comparison against?
I actually do not know. I know, I mean, I'm sure there are somewhat nearby, but in that same river, I'm not sure. That would be a good question to go with as well.
Yeah.
Nice, nice. All right. Does anyone else have any other questions? No. All right. Looks like it's it.
Thank you
Thanks,
guys for putting up with bugs for so long.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you guys.
Thank you. Really appreciate the talk. Andrew, I think that rounds out.
Okay, it does. All right. So for anyone who's interested in CFEs, I am posting the survey link and the secret password for today in the chat.
Perfect. And we'll stick around for a little bit if people have questions. Otherwise, thanks everyone for attending today. Thank you to the speakers for giving your talks. Appreciate it. For tomorrow, just so everyone has an idea, tomorrow's theme is going to be urban forestry. We'll have some student presentations, but we'll also have Tom Hansen and Deb McGarry talking to us about urban forestry. So otherwise, thanks for coming today. It's been great, and looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow too.